the things, right? It's fucking crazy.
It's,
And it's been a long time coming.
Oh yeah, I mean, what's funny is I was just saying this to somebody the other day. I was telling them about something that I told
all the things, right?
someone.
It's fucking crazy. Sorry. Oh,
okay. So I could hear us. Yeah.
That was yeah.
Yeah. So I told somebody back in 2007, and I remember where I was. Remember where we were. I was talking to my wife about it too, and she remembers when I said this. And we were in it's a bakery. It's actually a co-op bakery in Oakland. Well, there's one in Oakland, a couple in Oakland, one in Emeryville. There's another one in Berkeley called the Cheese Boys. A place called Arizmendi. And I can't remember what happened at the time. It was probably like a shooting or something had gone down. And I told him, I said, yo, if you plan on staying here, if you stay in the US, I said, you better get ready to knuckle up. I told somebody that 13 years ago. Because it was in the air.
Yeah.
It was in the air.
It's been building.
Yeah, we left the Bay and when my family moved over here in March of 2009, and then I eventually made it over here in December of 2009, like all of us. So so we've been over here since December 2009 and just been, watching the whole thing kind of devolve.
What would you say the role of this sort of, I mean, there's so many layers of this, right? But what would you say the role of, being a Black man and how society and the police and everything interacts with, in general, with Black men? How did that play into your decision to peace out and, be an expatriate?
No, that was definitely a part of the calculus. Like,
yeah.
No question. I mean, that that wasn't the entire, that certainly wasn't that informed the entire sort of corpus of the reason why I left. But you just feel like these people really feel like they got a right to my life.
Yeah.
I mean, you look and it's not even, you're not even making, it's not an emotional reaction. Like it's like risk assessment, right? It's like, you're analyzing, it's like you have situational awareness and then you are analyzing the place in which you are having to operate. And, you're weighing up pros and cons and opportunities and, you're doing like a little SWOT analysis, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And at some point you're just like, gee, this isn't really stacking up well, and I was just thinking, it was funny, I was just driving over into the other neighboring village to get some groceries a moment ago, and I was just having this thought while I was driving over the hill, and I said, like, all of this stuff is based on a kind of a delusional idea or delusional understanding of what people believe the world is and who they are and who other people in their, is it as held in their imagination, like who other people are. And there's a kind of this rendering that you are expected to believe in and live according to. And I'm thinking, and I said to myself, why am I expected to validate your delusion? Like, that's your problem. That's not my problem. That's your problem. And so I'm not obliged to adhere to your delusional understanding of the world.
Yeah.
So, so if we're applying this understanding to something like race, first of all, that's not even a scientifically valid idea.
Yeah.
Like, so for example, I'm assuming, are you of French extraction? It's landed with
French, German, like Alsatian, from my, from my father's last name and a mix of, you know, a whole variety of other places, but that's
Right.
the like paternal line. Yeah.
Right. So you're French, German, Alsatian, you know, whatever the mix is. Like if you were in, like somehow in Europe, right? Your folks were French, German, Alsatian. I live in England, right? And in the British Isles, there are certain, you know, there's a mix of people in
There's
the British
Welsh
Isles.
and there's, you
Right,
know,
as
yeah,
well.
and
There's
Scots and there's
Scottish,
this
there's,
sort of
you know, there's Irish, there's you
Anglos and
know,
Saxons and
right,
Normans
yeah,
and
Anglo,
Irish.
exactly. You got Anglos and Saxons and Normans and all those people.
Oh my, oh my.
Right, and then these people have been beating the crap out of each other for centuries. How do you cross the Atlantic Ocean and suddenly
And become white? Yeah.
How did that happen? Like, how does that happen?
Well, one of my favorite
Suddenly,
quotes is whiteness is just a figment of white people's imagination.
I mean, it has a no. I mean, it has a function.
Yeah.
It has a function. It's just like examining how does that idea have any kind of like again, it doesn't have any validity as a scientific phenomenon. And
Yeah.
this has been, I mean, this is like just like black. Like
Doesn't, yeah, black is meaningless. Yeah, what does that mean?
I mean, Africa, I mean, if you go to Africa, I mean, probably the largest variations in phenotype.
It's a whole universe.
On the continent of Africa.
It's a whole universe. It's a whole,
right.
Do you know about your more specific ancestry?
I don't, but I can, but it's interesting you asked that. So, I mean, so again, living in England has been is actually really fascinating for me. So I happen to live in a place, I live on the waters of Plymouth Sound, right? So I live just across Plymouth Sound from the city of Plymouth. So you can actually get from my place to the Mayflower Steps in about, I don't know, maybe half hour, 20 minute like ferry ride. Like it's a place where the Mayflower left.
Yeah.
In 1620, right? So these are the waters where the Mayflower left from. These are the waters that James Cook left from when he went to Polynesia and, you know, all those places, like he quote unquote discovered all those places, like for the English. It's where James Cook left from. It's where Charles Darwin left from on the HMS Beagle. It's where Sir Francis Drake left from. I've been to his estate, Buckland Abbey. It's about 45 minutes, maybe, you know, from my house. So this is like and this whole area, this whole coastline is you know, this is where between Devon and Cornwall, this is where like all the smugglers and pirates and stuff used to run all kinds of contraband. And I mean, so this is kind of an interesting place, you know, from a historical standpoint. And for me, I mean, my last name is Kent, right? My dad's father, my biological grandfather, who funnily enough, I didn't meet till after my father died. You know, he died in a car accident. And I kind of got a little bit more insight into, you know, where these folks are from in Maryland. So, you know, my mom's folks are from South Carolina. My dad's folks are from, on my dad's side from Maryland, on my dad's side from Maryland, on my dad's mother's side from Bermuda and Barbados. So Bermuda and Barbados obviously were parts of, you know, the British Commonwealth. I read a book that was written by a historian named Dr. Gerald Horne called I think it's called the Apocalypse of White. Hold on, I got this book. Great book. I can't find it right now, but it's I think it's called the Apocalypse of White Settler Colonialism or something like that. Guy's an amazing historian. So in reading that book, I didn't realize this before, but South Carolina was a colony of Barbados. That's how it came into being. So you know, Barbados was after reading that book, I was able to connect these two sides of the family that I didn't actually realize, you know, these histories were connected. I mean, aside from the fact that, yeah, we know that those slaves and Africans were brought to here and there, but actually the Carolinas, or South Carolina, was a colony of Barbados after basically Barbados had been maxed out in, you know, like sugarcane production and whatever
plantation
else
economy.
The plantation system had just basically maxed out and moved to the mainland. The entire system of of what eventually was used to actually control slaves was developed in Barbados.
Yeah.
And there's a guy named Sir Hilary Beckles who, who's written, lots and lots of he's done a lot of research into that and written books on the whole history of how that all worked. So, that's where I come from. So it's really difficult to. I mean, I found out my wife's, my wife's British. She was born in Devon, grew up in Cornwall. One of the family names on my dad's side, the side that comes from Barbados, is Pasco. I didn't realize. I found out, after years of coming here, that Pasco is a Cornish name. So I kind of accidentally walked into a place where I assume I actually have some ancestry in Cornwall.
Yeah.
Maybe they were pirates. I don't know. They probably were pirates. I don't know. Anyway, so I mean, I don't have any. We often have. I know on my mom's side, they've kind of would sometimes talk about, well, I think we're from the Ashanti, the Ashanti tribe in Ghana. Clearly, we're probably, West African, but it's really hard to ascertain, given, the history tied to the folks I come from. I think what's interesting is, if you look at some of that information about the history of the slave trade, and specifically the history of the slave trade in North America, they only brought something like 450 or 500,000 slaves into North America, and then they just bred them out. So actually, they would ship them into, places like Charleston, South Carolina, and then slave breeding actually took place in areas like Maryland. And it was a lucrative industry. So you think by the time, so you ship in over the course of, I guess between 1619, and actually you go earlier than that, the 1590s, when Sir John Hawkins, who was a relative of Francis Drake, first started bringing Africans to North America. But between 1619 and 1807, because 1807 was when if I remember correctly, 1807 was when the actual trade in slaves was outlawed. So between 1619 and 1807, you brought roughly 500,000 slaves, 450,000, 500,000 slaves into North America. The vast majority went to South America, like Brazil, went to the Caribbean. So between 1807, between 1807 to 1865, right? You eventually get to the point at the, sometime in and around the start of the Civil War of 1860, 1861, you got 4 to 5 million Africans, or people who are descended from Africa. So you got an order of magnitude increase in population, by and large through the breeding of what was essentially human livestock. So that's part of my origin story. But I think what's interesting to examine is what was the thinking that legitimated the idea that was something to do, right? And that this was a good idea, and it was permissible, right? And so there's a whole process that you got to go through in order to arrive to the place where you sort of marshal the resources, you gather the energies, you get the people up. You got to kind of condition them to say, what, this is something you ought to participate in, right? So you got the things like the Royal Africa Company, and you got the East Africa Company, all these you have institutions that are created to facilitate this activity. And another interesting thing that I've come to discover, the great thing about the British, the great thing about the English is they're very good at documenting the good and the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
So you can find out pretty much whatever you want, right, about kind of what they've done in the world. Well, one of the interesting things I found out a few years ago, this was written in an article by I think I saw it in the UK Independent, but there's a a British researcher, historian named Dr. Nick Draper. I think he's at the University College of London, and he did he along with his colleagues uncovered something like 46,000 documents that are basically receipts, which were used as part of a repayment scheme. It was kind of a repayment program to compensate British slave owners for their property losses after slavery was abolished. So apparently in the year 1834, approximately 40% of the entire British treasury was paid to people who had owned slaves. Right? A payment was made for property losses, quote unquote. So that's basically it's what they call compensated emancipation, and there were a number of countries that did it. But that's what we would call reparations.
Yeah,
literally, that's what we would call reparations. So in 1834, I believe the quantity that was quoted was 20 million British pounds were paid to something like 3,000 families.
You have any idea how much that's worth these days?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. In today's money, that would be equivalent to approximately 17 billion British pounds, or about 30 billion US dollars. So if you were to look at some of the people that had received these monies, these funds, most of them, or many of them, went on to become leaders in British business, finance, government, the arts. Many of them went on to become prime ministers. They started banks. And one of the other things I connected to that, if you look at the timeline, so it's 1830s. You're in the midst of it's the British Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So I think you could safely say that the funds that were received by those people for their property losses went on to finance the British Industrial Revolution.
well, yeah, the mechanization. There's a whole piece there where I actually think the strange and somewhat maybe unthinkable thought that got rationalized and led to the ability for a whole group of people to be able to talk themselves into how it's okay to enslave and turn other humans into cattle. I don't actually think that thought disappeared. I think, I think it just sort of attached itself to the, sort of the enslavement and mechanization and, all of the shit, what happens next with the joint stock company in India and what happens next. There's just sort of like, there's a rolling history of what happens after that. Even though in England and the Commonwealth, there's no slavery in quotes, so anyway, it's interesting mental gymnastics for sure.
It is. I think what's also, it's just also interesting. I think the idea that, you also have to come up with ways of convincing people that, again, this is something that they ought to participate in and they ought to enable. So obviously, part and parcel of that is the propagation of this idea of this curious phenomenon called race, right? So you eventually have the creation of something called, again, a quote unquote white people. And then you have the creation of this other thing called a black people.
Well, it's interesting. Just to riff on this for a second, it's been a while since I was deep in this historical reading, so I'm not able, as you've done, to call up authors and titles, unfortunately. But I remember reading it's definitely, there's a book called The Many-Headed Hydra, which you should read, and I'd love your take on it. It's definitely referenced there, where it's talking about the commonality between African slaves, indentured servants, sailors, pirates, this whole class of people, and how racism was essentially invented because these people kept getting together. They kept getting together, and they kept saying, I'm not going to put up with this. This is my brother over here, and this is my sister, and people had solidarity. And racism was basically like the solution to maintain property rights. That was
right. No, that's exactly it. I mean, in at least in American history, the seminal moment where that fracturing took place was Bacon's Rebellion.
Yeah.
Right, Nathaniel Bacon.
Yep.
I was, oddly enough, my in-laws, my wife's stepfather, and I guess my mother-in-law, their last name is Bacon. I don't know if there's any relation. I've asked them. I think I've asked them before, but Bacon's Rebellion was that's when people were shaking in their boots.
They're scary for people. Yeah, I mean, well, and it's not just that one. I mean, read this Many-Headed Hydra. I was so surprised. A group of free Black men and women. Some of them escaped. Some of them, born free, and sailors, took over Manhattan. Rebelled and took over Manhattan, and there was like a historical accident that there was like this, and I don't remember what it was, like something happened. They basically had taken it over, and the British Army managed to take it back through pure luck. And it was this close several times. It's chronicled. There were several really big moments before the revolution where history could have been totally different. We could have been like New York City could have been owned and run by a ragtag group, diverse group of people from all over the world.
By pirates, like real pirates.
Pirates. That's right.
Yeah,
people who've been pressed into service. I mean, talk about slave, like people who've been pressed into service, put on ships and sailed across the world, and then we're like, fuck this. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Yeah.
But these are, it's interesting seeing the way that again we've gotten to this point, and the way, the way you arrive here is there are a handful of, again, compelling ideas that kind of inspire people, motivate people, compel people to move, and to do things. And for whatever reason, that again, there's a particular set of ideas that are animating, again, a number of, again, different kind of parties, a number of different groups, to invest whatever, time, energy, talents, what have you, to advocate for, a particular way of rendering the world that eventually, leads to a particular destination where once you arrive there, there's certain things that are expected of people, right? And for some, one of those expectations is that they're made to submit themselves to being humiliated and to being brutalized and to be taken advantage of, and in some cases, to allow themselves to be killed, right? So there's an expectation, which again, I mean, I've arrived to a place, and I've kind of got all my explanations and reasons for believing this way. It's a delusional idea. It's ridiculous. Like, it's absurd. but the problem, the problem with an absurdity, like people don't necessarily give up an idea because it's absurd. Especially if the absurdity advantages you.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. What's the quote? I think it's Upton Sinclair's. Like, you can't get a man to understand something that that his paycheck depends on him not.
Depends on, right. And it's funny. There's a word for that. It's actually. I was just reminded of it. It's actually the study of the propagation of ignorance. It's called agnotology.
Right? I saw that on your Facebook. It's a fantastic word.
Yeah, or another term, and this actually comes from the sociologist, West Indian sociologist named Charles Mills. The idea of an inverted epistemology, right? So if epistemology is the study of study of knowledge, the study of how you know things.
How do you know?
Right. So the inverted epistemology is, again, like how to not know things.
Right.
Right. So you kind of turn it on its head. So you can
so there's a lot of that going around in social media right now. That's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to talk. Why I wanted to take time to have like a nice long conversation with you, because I feel like social media is this inverted epistemological landscape in which everybody, even my well-intended friends, people who are like, maybe their instincts are in the right direction, but they're sort of like, they're like rage tweeting and instinctually retweeting stuff and all this stuff, and it's like, how do you parse, how do you know what that meme was that you just retweeted and who manufactured it for your consumption?
Right, and what's funny about this is, I'm assuming you've seen that Adam Curtis documentary, Hypernormalization. Yeah. So there's a British Russian British journalist named Peter Pomerance, who he wrote a book called "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And it's a book about his experience, his experiences in Russia, probably from the early noughts, to the early teens. And he went there, to be a writer for like Russian reality television. And he talks about this whole sort of class of people in Russia, and the one that is of particular interest is this guy named, I think is Vladislav Surkov. I think that's what his name is. He's the guy who basically is responsible for Vladimir Putin being in power.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this term, they call it political technologists, and essentially what they do is, and Surkov was like a playwright. Like, that was his trade. Like he wrote, and it's funny because all this stuff like makes all the sense in the world, because if you think of all the great Russian writers, like Dostoevsky, and like all that great Russian literature, it's having the ability to create these narratives. Even someone like Ayn Rand, people forget Ayn Rand's Russian.
Yeah.
Right? What are the ideas that have captured all the movers and shakers in America? It's Ayn Rand's writings. It's
objectivism,
it's Shrugged and the Fountainhead and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, man, you gotta look out for these Russians, man. These Russian writers, these Russian novelists, like throwing a wrench in the works. They're messing up the game. But
it's the theater of the absurd. It's sort of like postmodern. Up is down, down is up. It's an art form there. I can't remember this. The name of this woman eludes me. She has a podcast. I listened to her on the Eric Weinstein show, which I sometimes tune into its podcast, and she was saying there's actually a Russian word for the specific type of humor. Like, there's a word in the culture for the specific type of humor that in which you don't know if the person is fucking with you or if they're being real, and you can't tell. but it's fun. But it's funny. Like there's a word for that in Russian. Like it is so deeply ingrained. This sort of chimera. Like, is it true? Is it not true?
Yeah, is it true?
Am I being ironic? Am I being sarcastic? Right. You can't tell. It's like
and what's funny and what's brilliant about that is because you don't know exactly what's going on, you can't mount a defense.
Well, you just say fuck it.
You can't because you actually don't really know what's going on. And because you don't know what's going on, like, so say it kind of in boxing or fighting terminology, like you can't set your feet to get ready to return a punch.
Yeah.
So because you can't, because you are uncertain about the actual position of kind of your target. So because you can't locate the target, you can't counter. And this is what's brilliant about.
That's how I feel on social media about, and specifically, I've been really feeling that about this moment in time on multiple levels. I mean, coronavirus, definitely also, like what the hell's going on, and with this stuff, like I'm trying to make sense of this, and I have a very similar, I very much appreciated you immediately just taking us back to the roots and like the historical context. So I've read similar or the same history. I have my instincts are that and my research and sort of my perspective it sounds very similar to yours. Okay, so we're trying to build meaning. We get up to this present moment, and I have to ask questions. I have to ask questions like so there's an assumption. I have 100% agreement on there's structural and cultural racism, essentially. I think that's probably the best word for it. Although I think it turns into a straw man if it's used incorrectly, but it's like it is racism because race doesn't exist, like as you're saying. It's like
the problem is because all that language is loaded.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been loaded, and it's been loaded on purpose to make this even harder for us to not. So we get to this moment in time, and then I'm watching riots, I'm watching peaceful protests, I'm watching cops take a knee with the protesters, and I'm like in tears. I'm like, there's some of that happen. I'm like, there's some of that happening. I'm watching, sheriffs join the march, maybe a political stunt, but still, like, that's awesome. Okay, I'm watching masked like white kids who look like Antifa, but I don't know if they aren't throwing bricks through windows. I'm watching all this stuff, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell is going on. I don't know. I have no idea if there's some Russian plants throwing bricks through windows, or there's some crazy white supremacist nut jobs trying to accelerate some race war, or some like, I know kids in Portland who are part of Antifa who probably would throw a brick through a window if they had the chance. Like, I know those people. I'm not saying they don't exist. Maybe it's them. I'm just like, what the hell's going on?
No, you're right. No, you are absolutely right. And therein lies the problem. And there are people. I mean, there is this whole science of misinformation.
Yeah.
And that is very much a part of the zeitgeist. Is misinformation or malinformation, bad information, right? And that ends up becoming, like a camouflage, right? It becomes a camouflage
for all the worst things.
And this is like Orwell. This is like Orwell Huxley, right? So
it's somewhere between. It's like you can't. It's like, it's interesting because quantum. Just thinking quantum. Is it a particle or is it a wave? Is it Orwellian or are we living on island? Like where it's all, it's kind of both at the same time. It's
right. And again, because it becomes very difficult to ascertain exactly what's going on, and people are ripe for the picking. They're ripe for the picking. You can pretty much do whatever you want because everyone's like frozen, or if they're not frozen. And then they end up, and they know that we're gonna. that many of us are going to end up acting emotionally, and then not to mention the fact that then you have like Freud's whole thing with like Adam Curtis's Century of the Self documentary, looking at Freud's analysis of the fact that people don't make decisions based on
emotional.
They're not rational, right? It's not just a matter. We're not computers. You don't just like feed information to people or present it to people and then expect.
There is no rational actor. Like that whole economics perspective and like Ayn Rand objectivism around like, okay, you create this ethos that I'm going to make the most rational decision based on my success in the world or whatever. Like people don't do that.
That's not how we work. We're not we're not machines.
Well, no, it's much like, more complex and tribal, and it's like deep. We have this body, mind, and even trying to separate out an individual from their context is really hard, right? Because I don't remember sort of who said this, but there's a common trope, especially amongst the sort of like entrepreneurial folks that I hang out with, software people, VCs, investors, these crew, they commonly say this sort of trope, which is you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And that's like understood even at that hyper individualistic kind of culture of success and individualism and like like the fantasy of like driving and driving the car and like you're in control. Even those people are super clear that somehow we imprint and take on the characteristics, the mental capacity, the vocabulary, the capability of the people we spend the most time with. We're not an island. We're an interconnected. We're connected somehow, and that feels like it's super important. So, one of the things that I really want to talk to you, I want to get your take on a couple of different things. One of them is the sort of wokeness in America and globally, and where the sort of the postmodern critical theory, sociological perspective, intersectionality, intersectional feminism, and all these things. The right in the U.S. right now has sort of like done I think a very good job sort of lumping all of that together and calling it wokeness or social justice warriors, or sort of saying like all of that stuff is bullshit. Because some of it is, which there's no doubt.
I agree. I'm not one of those folks who throws all that stuff in the same bag. It's because it doesn't belong in the same.
It doesn't belong in the same bag. Yeah. So I want to kind of get your take on that.
For example, I'll give you a quick example. I mean, if you look at the history of feminism, right? There's a lot of feminism that's hella racist. There's a lot of feminism, a lot of that. You read some of those early feminist people. There's a guy named Dr. Tommy Curry who wrote a book called The Man Not. You should look up this guy. Really, really sharp guy. And he lays a lot of that, stuff out, that, the kind of gendered, sort of critiques, or a lot of those things that become part of this conversation, especially the conversation as it accords to race. So, for example, the kind of revisionist history about feminism that somehow like Black women and white women are in the same bag, and that they were somehow always riding for each other. That ain't the case at all. That's not the case at all. That doesn't resemble any of the history of where feminism came from. Feminism was about white women trying to be on the same footing as their husbands and their brothers and their fathers, and they were trying to get in the room with those people.
Yeah.
And they felt like, and part of what they were advocating for is they felt like, for example, Black men should not be ahead of them.
Right.
And so a part of the way they got ahead was they threw folks like black men under the bus.
Yeah.
Who do you think some of these people were? You know, telling folks that some nigga raped me.
That's this recent video that went viral of this woman in Central Park with the little dog and thing. Just sort of, you know, that feels like it was a pretty. Well, what do you think? What do you feel about Van Jones? Basically, I didn't watch his. I wasn't like watching him live, but I saw it all get retweeted when he said he basically said, you know, black folks, the people we need to worry about are not, you know, the ardent, crazy white supremacists. They're, you know, liberal women who voted for Hillary Clinton. That's who we got to watch.
No, he's absolutely right, because he's not the first person to say that. I mean, the folks he's quoting are Martin Luther King and Malcolm X.
Yeah,
that was their critique, you know, in the 60s. You know, James Baldwin, all those people had the same critique. You know, so, anybody that was, you know, they all had the same critique. That, like, those are the people you got to look out for, because the, you know, the racist, conservative, KK, like they're easy to identify. It's the folks that are coming up to you and like acting like they're your friends. And in reality, even if they're well intentioned, the fact of the matter is, at some point you realize these people are a liability.
Well, so let's dig into this a little bit. Let me take a crack at unpacking why that is and see if it's right, and then you just dig in and go from there. So my sense of this is it's very similar. So if you know, let's just use you and I as a concrete example. So if we start to develop a relationship, you know, hypothetically, this, that, and the other happens, you know, at a certain point, it's very likely that there'll be differential access. Like I'll be able to access a different group of people who maybe have more money, whatever. And at a certain point, there's like an incentive moment where I have to choose, like, hey, are you going to betray Gregory? Are you going to betray Rhamis in order to get this extra payout because these people want to take his share? You know, they can metabolize. They haven't been part of the partnership. They don't know what's going on. They can sort of like, eventually, like everything goes to this moment, and then there's a choice, and some critical percentage, not all people, and it's like there's free will, but some critical percentage of you know, white people are going to choose at that moment. Yeah, quote, yeah, for those who are listening instead of watching, I'm doing air quotes here.
The people who believe themselves
some critical percentage of white people at that moment, not all, not 100%, because people are individuals in some way or like have different moral compasses or ethics, but at some point, you know, that hypothetical Gregory and Rhamis partnership, Gregory is going to betray Rhamis, and he's going to say, I'm going to take that extra 20% or whatever it is, and then I'm going to divide Rhamis' spoils amongst those other fucking people who just showed up and made me the deal. And essentially, like, that's kind of the structural, that's what it is. And you can play that out through voting, you can play that out through politics, you can play that in other ways. Is that an accurate representation of like what the threat is, like the structural threat is from your perspective, that, you know, that all these folks that MLK was talking about, that Van Jones just brought back up, that you're pointing to? Is that kind of an accurate representation?
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, the problem is that you have folks that, again, would like to believe themselves. Like, these are folks who really would like to believe.
Well, no, I'm going to believe I'll never do that. Like, I would never do that. I'm still play acting here. I'm saying, like.
No, I know. So let me just let me see if I could string this out. So I mean, the thing is, so these are people who, by and large, like, they really want to believe that they're good people, and they really believe that they're good people.
Yeah.
And which is again, I mean, that's I mean, that's fine.
And maybe we can even say they're good people, but you can't be a good person in a shitty system.
Yeah, like, well, therein lies the problem.
There's some percentage of people that are always going to be good, and they're going to make the wrong choice at that moment, and it's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, one of the you know, one of my go-tos always when you know, talking about this stuff is James Baldwin, and he, you know, one of the quotes I love trotting out is, you know, he says, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do.
Yeah.
like, at some point, it's like, you're telling me this stuff, but I mean, it's like, there's a great clip of him on the Dick Cavett show, saying, like, he says, I don't know if, fill in the blank is racist. All I know is, like, I can't buy a house in this neighborhood. I can't get a loan at the bank. I look at the books that my kids are having to, or the resources that my kids have in the schools that they have to go to. I can't get into the union. I don't know. I can't say for certain whether or not
any individual is racist, but
I just know that there are these structures, there are these edifices, there are these things in place that you have access to, my supposed ally, and I don't, right? And if you are really my ally, if you're really down for me, then make it so that I can get access to the same stuff that you can, right? I should be able to. So if we're really, and ultimately, the American problem for us is that if we are citizens, right, like other people are citizens, then why are we not able to enjoy the benefits and the protections, right, and the access that other that other citizens have access to? So you end up, what we're constantly told, and oftentimes is, then you enter into this whole sort of respectability politics thing, right? Which is like, well, there's certain things you got to do. Once you get this degree, you kind of appropriate this appearance.
Then you're good. Then you're
right.
Good.
I mean, we've been auditioning since the late 16th century, essentially, and we're constantly auditioning, right? Like, come back, practice your lines some more. Come back, maybe maybe you'll get the part. It's like, it's really funny.
It's like, it does seem like it's also worth calling out, and I don't know if this is true or not, like, in a complete absolutist sense, but it seems to me that if the playing field was tilted like this at the beginning, which is like, African American people are the base of the economy because they're being exploited, just straight up slavery, just pure and simple. We've been tilting the playing field a little bit, and who knows, maybe right now we're at, like, it's teetering back and forth. It's still a tilt, but it's not the same. So some people are going to be like, well, it's not the same, what are you talking about? And other people are going to be like, there's still a tilt. But what's important is to, like, understand in granular detail what exactly that sort of, those structural incentives and, like, in aggregate, can you get a fucking loan to buy a house as a Black worker? Can you or can't you? And what percentage of the time? And all those things. Like, we just have to be super.
And then not only that, it's not only can I get a house or can I get a loan to buy a house. It's like, can I get a loan to buy a house in an area where the housing value appreciates?
Yeah.
And I'm not penalized because of who I am, right?
Or can we bring investment? It's sort of like there's a bunch of different. It's interesting. There's a bunch of different strategies here, but and it feels to me like there's lots of people, like lots of good people, of many different. I don't even, there's many different communities working on this. I see people who I think are very competent working on these challenges. The challenge, but it's sort of like it's gonna take us another 50 years at that pace, or maybe it'll never happen.
Frankly, bro, and I gotta keep it a buck. I don't know if you got 5. Honestly, I mean, at this point, I don't know if you got 5. I don't know, like, the stuff that's going on now.
That's what I'm pointing out. That's the issue, right? It's like, at the pace, the change can't keep up with the demand for, like, it's time now. This is too much bullshit. Which is,
I don't know how you. I don't see how you walk this back. I don't, and not because it's not a good idea, because I don't know if there are enough people who are in the right places, who are as committed to making the changes that you're talking about as the people are committed to ensuring that doesn't happen.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's the crux right there. Is like for every, for every Atlanta where there's a strong Black community and they've been working really hard for a long, long time, and maybe it's not perfect, but there's some semblance of of something different playing out. There's Washington D.C. and or there's five D.C.
There's Prince George's County, and PG County got its own issues. Because then there's this whole this whole thing about what some people would call aspirational Negroes, right? Where basically is the goal really to become effectively what I call melanated white people,
right?
Is that
cultural? You're just adopting the culture of the dominant class and saying like, I'll just do everything. I'll just jump through every hoop. I want access. That's what I want.
And that's the thing that I question is, and this is pretty much sort of every quote unquote minority or every quote unquote out group that has ever been in the U.S. is that that everyone everyone's trying to get their place at the table, right? And that in order to get your place at the table, you effectively have to become sort of a lesser version of the people that you are auditioning for. So I'll give you a great example: the Irish.
Yeah.
Right. The Irish. They're the poster children for this.
Yeah. Totally.
Right. They've been getting the crap beat out of them for 800 years. My wife's Irish.
They were Irish. Straight up.
My father-in-law.
Straight up enslaved.
My father-in-law supported them. Huh? What was that?
Straight up enslaved, just like Irish were part of the breeding program in Barbados with
my father-in-law supported them. Right, he and his brothers they talk about all that crazy, orange men versus the IRA stuff, and people getting black and deckered. Like they lived in the middle, all that.
Yeah.
And it's like, what happens to the Irish when they come to America? People like Daniel O'Connell, the Irish nationalist. He told the one that he was over here hosting Frederick Douglass and he was saying how the Irish that were coming to America you guys should be on the same side as the slaves, as these black folks. That's not what happened.
Well, they were, and then they weren't because
at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, at some point, like you're like, I don't know if I like being on the other side of this, right?
Well, let me ask you a question: Can a liberal democratic capitalist society actually structurally change in the way that's needed to to create solidarity and harmony and mutual care, mutuality between different groups of people, different cultures of people who have their own individual character and their own depth of story and history? Like, is it possible within that framework? From your perspective?
I don't know if it's a matter. I don't think the question is whether or not it's possible. It's a question of whether or not people want it. I don't know if you got enough people that want it. So, so it goes back to what I was saying before. Look, all this stuff is absurd. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. But the problem is, if you are advantaged by the absurdity and the ridiculousness, you are less likely to identify it and call it as such, because you're advantaged by it. So it's not a question of whether or not it's possible. Sure, it's possible. But there's a difference between something being possible and then the possible being made real because people want to make it real. And I don't know if there are actually enough people who want to make it real, who are committed to doing whatever they need to do to ensure that it becomes real. And to the degree which they have they have as much certainty in the belief that it should be made real, that it exceeds the certainty and the belief that the people who don't want it to be made real, like they are willing to actually do what's necessary to ensure that those people are not going to stop them. I don't think you have enough of those folks. I don't think you have enough of those people. Now that's not, it's not, you know, and that's not an emotional response. That's just the reality. You have folks that are committed, and then you have folks that are committed to a point, right?
Uh-huh.
There are limits.
Yeah. And then you got folks who are who are going the other direction as hard and fast as they can.
Right. And then you got folks who are, going in the other direction as hard and as fast as possible. And then you have folks that are just indifferent. Right. And then what you got to do
telling, or like, you know, which way the wind blows, you know, on any given day, they may sort of, what did my neighbor do? What did my neighbor do? What did, you know, yeah.
Right. But that's what
did Fox News tell me to do?
But the thing is, that's what MLK and Malcolm X were talking about. Yeah. Is that the reason why those moderates are dangerous is because you end up becoming lulled into having a false sense of security because you think you have an ally. You think you have somebody on the team. And the fact of the matter is, you don't. It's someone who they mean well. They don't, but the problem is they don't mean well enough.
Well, the question is always, and this is kind of what I was trying to paint with the hypothetical of like, okay, we're partners, it goes to this certain point. The question is like, are you willing to lose? Or are you just going to try to help the other person win up until the point where it gets risky that you might lose with them? Like I think that's the question for you know, in quotes, allies. Like are we actually willing? Like, are you willing to go hard enough to, and like in the moment, like, are you willing to just lose with the other, with you know, African-American people? Like, are we willing to lose? Or is it just until it's, you know, is it convenience? Is it, we go to the point where?
For me, it's simple. Either I'm a citizen, like you're a citizen, or I'm not.
Yeah.
And if I'm a citizen, and if I'm a citizen, I told this to an old friend of mine, like one of the most hard-headed people I've ever met in my life. As a kid, I went to high school, you know, I went to like grade school, all like first grade to probably 10th grade with until he transferred out. The most hard-headed people I ever met in my life. I grew up on Long Island. I'll tell you, so I'll give you an idea of where, like, just to kind of provide more context for this. I grew up on Long Island in the 70s and 80s, right? This is a place where, you see all those people that are on, you know, that are news folks on Fox News and all this, all those people are from where I come from.
Yeah.
Like the Congressman Peter King, that was my congressman.
Yeah.
In the area where I grew up. Like, so that gives you like Bill O'Reilly he graduated from a high school that the school that I went to used to play in high school sports. You know, Sean Hannity, all those guys. That gives you an idea about the kind of people that I grew up with, right? In part. So this kid I went to high school with went to, you know, he eventually became a firefighter. Now friends of mine became NYPD, you know, fire department, you know, New York Fire Department, all these guys. And some of these guys were, you know, were actually called to the towers on 9/11. And I had, over the years, had eventually become, like, got reconnected to them, like by way of Facebook. You know, but I hadn't talked to these people in, you know, 20, 25 years. And, you know, and during that time, I became Muslim 20 years ago. So obviously in kind of big, becoming reacquainted and them, you know, kind of discovering this, you know, we could have some really pitched conversations because folks have, you know, some particular ideas about that, in addition to whatever else, you know, makes me up, right? And in the course of that, and one of the things I said, and you know, in talking about the quote unquote the grievances that maybe people like me might have or might not have. I said, look, dude, I said, at the end of the day, if I'm a citizen, right, like you're a citizen, right, and I'm your friend, and these people come for me, if you have any regard for me, if you have any love for me, and if whatever times we have, from the period of time when we were 6 or 7 up to the time now when we're in our 40s, but if you don't come ride for me, if these folks come for me, if you can't advocate for me, right? I mean, what does it take? And then aside from the fact that, fine, they might do that because they know me. Like, what if they don't know me? And again, I'm just a citizen. And if we are citizens, and you're really about this America that you're constantly beating your chest about, like, do I really have to look like you in order for you to have a regard for me and have enough and believe enough in this idea that somehow the kind of the ethos that forms the foundation of this country includes me, right? That and you believe in that enough that you are going to defend me. If that system, in fact, prevents me from having the same type of access to the benefits and the protection as you do, then I'm going to feel some kind of way about the expectation that somehow I got to like buy into this idea the same way that you buy into it, because I'm not seeing the same benefits, right? I don't get the same reward. So I mean, so ultimately, unless we're all seen as being, equally worthy of that status, again within the context of the country, if it in fact is about all the people, right, for the people, I mean, then I mean, in fact, who are the people to begin with? Does the people include me? And it's funny. I mean, you have to actually start asking about how certain terms are defined. Like, who are the people? Who are the people? I don't know. I don't know if the people. I mean, we actually do know, that the people by and large did not include people like me.
Yeah,
so you go back to,
I mean, at the founding of the country, I think it kind of went back. There was definitely a conversation about it, and it definitely ended up that people like you were not included.
No, it's like Dred Scott. Dred Scott decision, 1857, right? Justice Taney, right? He said, he says that a black man had no rights, that a white man was bound to respect.
Well, but there was a calculus of how much black African American black people were worth in terms of their vote. What was
obviously the whole 3/5 compromise was to allow for representation in political representation in states that did not have as much of a free population, which would have prevented them from having the same kind of voice in government as those places that didn't. And they obviously they did have different interests, they had different needs, but again, it didn't include the voice of this other population of sentient beings, because they weren't people. So they don't have that. Again, whatever needs or concerns that they had weren't represented. And then I think the other amazing thing to think about, and this is it's astonishing that this isn't fully understood or appreciated, is the fact that dude, how can you be in a country how can you be in a place for 400 plus years and effectively not have any equity in it? You got no equity. like you don't, you have this whole lineage that's vested in the formation of the place, and yet none of it is yours. And that's not to say that, it's like you don't have a piece, you don't have a piece of that pie. And I think to a certain extent, I don't know if that's entirely a bad thing, because, that pie is kind of poisoned. And it's like, I don't, that might not be a bad thing that you don't have much of it. But I think that whole idea of, again, you're trying to get your place at the table so that you can get a piece of it. I think a more compelling, a more attractive proposition for me is we just need to build a new table that's actually worth pulling up to.
What does that look like?
What do you want it to look like?
Is that within the, within the geographic region of the United States of America? Is that, corporate structures? Is that, some sort of state structure? Is that somewhere else? Like what? I mean, I know that other people have had that thought, right? There's been, folks went back to Africa to sort of, try to build something new. In Liberia, things have been, there's been impulses, and maybe they're not exactly what you're saying, but just to try to land.
Yeah, I mean, I think we still have to ascertain, what forms the basis of what would eventually become that table. What would inform the design of the table, right? So it's one thing to say, like, we should make a new table. It's like, okay, well, what's it going to look like? And and how do we ensure that we can actually create places for everybody to be able to pull up? And I think one of the things that has to be done in order for that table to actually be made properly is we really have to account for the assumptions that inform the design which creates the table. Because if we go back and we actually look at the assumptions made that informed the design of the American table, I think we would see that there would be some problems. There's some serious flaws to again the initial ideas that inform the design of that table. What's funny is I wrote about maybe 7 years ago, I actually wrote an article for the PRI website called Permaculture and Slavery: A System Analysis. And one of the things I had said in it was that again, part and parcel of this idea of slavery was that it was found, again, necessary for whatever reason, that you had to that an entire group of people had to be made, in terms of like kind of the cognitive mapping of all of this, they had to be made into non-people.
Yeah.
You first had to, number one, create the concept, and then whatever was necessary to articulate that idea. Like you had to spend time in figuring out how to articulate the idea that these Black people were not people because they didn't look like you, right? And then you had to actually mobilize you had to actually marshal the energy and the forces that would allow for you to be able to go out and actually operationalize the idea. Because that's not something you do. That's not a snap judgment. Like that's something that's very considered. It's not easy. It's not easy to do. According to, again, what we have access to as far as the numbers, it's 12 plus million people. And you lost about 15%, something like that. I mean, a lot of them are at the bottom of the Atlantic. So, you know, I think number one, that flaw has to be, that faulty idea has to be addressed, right? So it's like, there is no such thing as, you know, there aren't any waste people. Because that's effectively what you're saying. You have people that can be kind of like, you have to distort the world. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. You literally have to you have to actively distort reality. Like you have to twist it into something that it isn't. And I think we have to begin from a place where you explicitly state that is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. That is a non-starter. And you have to deal with reality as it is. And then if you are ready to deal with reality as it is, then you can proceed and actually, you know, create something that makes sense given the actual nature of reality. You know, so for another example is you can't do what you want to the natural world and not expect for it to at some point come back and punch you in the face.
Yeah.
It's just gonna, it's like, it's not a shock. Like, that's gonna happen at some point. And that, and there's a whole like a set of historical literature, there's a whole patterning of history that actually makes that very clear.
Yeah, well, I mean, gosh, don't trouble me with trying to extend personhood all the way to nature, man.
It's not even. Well, it's funny. There's
sentience or care or whatever we want to say. Like the deep consideration of the health of another being.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been on a trajectory of trying to make that as limited as possible for quite some time. And I think what you're saying is it's got to change.
So part of the, I think this is part and parcel of a problem, and this kind of like feeds into stuff like what do you call it? Nicholas Nassim Taleb, right? Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the anti-fragility idea.
Yeah.
Right. Where if you try to take something that is complex, not necessarily complicated, it's complex, and in an effort to try to make it, number one, more understandable, and number two, by making it more understandable, you ostensibly are trying to make it more controllable, right? You immediately take that thing that was made to be complex and you make it worse.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of like, maybe if we were to say, the original sin of reductionism there. Have you read any Gregory Bateson or he speaks a lot about this, as does actually on the mathematical side, David Bohm talks about this, essentially, where if you are sort of creating a reductionist mechanical worldview, and which I think resonates with like you've been talking about, what does it take, that the enormous effort to sort of like in your mind willfully choose to see reality in such a way that is not real, so that you can simplify your actions, you can justify these otherwise unexcusable actions day to day to day to day. The enormous effort that is. David Bohm actually he's basically saying that reductionism, that choice to it is actually like ripping apart the fabric of space and time, basically, is what he's saying. It's like, we see it as enslavement and trauma, historical traumas, and we see it in our lives, we experience it in all these ways, and he's sort of saying, like, at a bigger level, it's just choosing to like rip asunder the universe because it's somehow easier than like attenuating one's consciousness to the actual complex living complexity that's there.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's literally like, it's like, you're sticking your head up your butt.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's like, and the refusal to deal with reality as it is, and again, to try to render it into something else, thinking that it's easier. Like,
but it's
you're
not.
actually
It's
doing
so hard. So much effort.
Right, you're
it's
doing
so much effort.
Right. It's like what Bill says in the designer's manual, right? It's an energy maintained disorder.
Yeah.
It's an energy maintained. Like, it's not as though this is easier to maintain.
Yeah. How many
Like,
calories
again,
do we
diluted.
use to just rip us under the earth to plant our corn? How much energy do we use to keep an entire culture oppressed? How much energy do you use to just like make it that way? Yeah, it's
Right. And the thing is, and the reason why people continue to do it is because it's what they're familiar with. It's what they know. Right? People are just doing it because it's what they know. They don't know anything else. But it's not as though it doesn't have an effect. So I'll give you an example. So I'm always fascinated by this. You're looking at these statistics, and you're able to, you decipher. It explains everything for you. So, for example, I remember when this was first brought to my attention. This is as a researcher, medical doctor at UC Davis, guy named Dr. Garen Winnemute, and he does a lot of research. He does a lot of research into the epidemiology of firearm violence in the U.S. And so one of the things he's tracked over the, I don't know, of course, the last maybe 15 years, 20 years, is the data connected to deaths due to firearm violence. And so every year, on average, there's about 30,000 deaths in the U.S. connected to firearm violence. About 11,000, 10 or 11,000 is homicide. 2/3 of it is suicides. If you look at the breakdown of that data demographically, guess who the bulk of that number is? That 2/3. Who do you think it is?
I mean, I gotta say it's probably Black people.
Nope. Which is actually very curious. In spite of all the stuff, in spite of all of this, this nonsense we got to deal with, it's not Black folks who are killing.
Well, hold on. Hold on a second. So, let me wrap my head around the statistic. Is the statistic the actual number or the proportional number?
Of the 30,000 deaths per year on average that are due to firearms, right? Firearm violence.
Yeah.
2/3 of that 30,000 is actually suicides. 1/3 is homicide.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah.
So what I was asking was in
Makes
terms
sense.
of demographics of who do you think the bulk of that 2/3 is?
That's definitely white men.
Precisely.
Definitely
older,
white, for sure.
Older white men.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Older white men. Again, which is very interesting. So how is it that the group of people, the demographic, that this entire system is essentially constructed to advantage? Why are these people killing themselves?
Would you like me to answer that?
I mean, you could. I mean, but I mean, again, it's just you're thinking about, okay, and when you talking about what you just said about renting, you are renting asunder the fabric of space and time, and through this attempt to make the world or make reality into something that it's not. Like, again, what kind of effect does that have on you?
It has that effect that you just pointed out. It has the effect of it. I would argue, and some of this thinking is thanks to longtime teacher of mine, Martine Prechtel. the unmetabolized grief of that willful choice to perpetuate a system of violence and oppression is unbearable. It's unbearable, and it makes you go crazy. That's
okay. So with that, let's extend it to drug use, right? United States is arguably it's got to be the biggest drug market, or easily one of the biggest drug markets on the planet. Whether you're talking about opiates or psychoactive drugs, or whatever narcotic you could name.
And who's using them?
Who's using them?
Yeah.
Not only is who's using them, who has the money to buy them? It's not black folks have the money to buy them. 12% of the population. Economically, we're at the bottom of the barrel. Something like 10 cents there, 10 cents to every 10. Black Americans have 10 cents of wealth to every dollar of white wealth. Right? That's roughly the demographic. And yet, those are the people who are having to bear the brunt of the drug war over the past 25 years or whatever it's been, 30 years, 35 years. Why they're not the people that are buying the dope? Why aren't the people that are actually trafficking the stuff in and buying it and using it? Why aren't they the ones who are actually bearing the brunt of the drug war? Right? Because it's not who's buying this stuff. We haven't got the money to buy it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just just like we don't have the money. We haven't got the money to buy the guns, right? It's like something like 265 million firearms in the United States. Like, who's got them? We ain't got them. We don't have the money. Why? So we don't have the money for the gun. Why are we the ones why are we bearing the brunt of the violence? That's meted out by law enforcement agency. Because we don't have enough to comprise enough of a threat, right, to actually rationally justify or explain the levels of violence that you see meted out to those people. Because we haven't got the stuff. So it doesn't fit. Like square peg, round hole, the information doesn't make any sense. That is actually informing or fueling what you see happening, like out in the world on the street. We haven't got the guns. You just had a bunch of people walk up into the State House in Michigan with guns strapped across their chest, flak jackets and magazines sticking out everywhere. Like how are those people not the threat? And how these people that are out in the street, trying to, quote unquote, non-violently protest, how those people getting shot with rubber bullets or real bullets or whatever, how do those people comprise the threat?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, here's the problem. Because this kind of treatment that you see being exacted to this particular group of people, you don't do that to people who aren't weak. The only people you do that to are weak people. Like the reason why you don't do it to anybody else, the reason why you don't do it to other folks is because you know that the response to what it is that you would be doing to them endangers your own safety. So you do it to people that you know your safety is not in question. That's the only reason why it happens.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking about that, I mean, there's so much truth to what you're saying, and so much complexity that it tugs on, because that's sort of like, I mean, I don't think monolithically, but predominantly white militia movement that you're talking about, or whatever we want to call it. I don't know what we even call it these days. I don't know. But when I was,
you can call
when
it.
I was growing up, it was the militia movement, and they
like
were all in
Turner Diaries and all that stuff.
All that shit. And there was a moment in the 90s when the feds went hard after those folks.
Yeah, like the Branch Davidians, David Koresh,
all that stuff.
All those dudes, yeah.
And what happened out of that was Timothy McVeigh is what happened out of that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And again, that's precisely why they backed off.
I mean, I think that's a pretty logical.
Exactly why they backed off.
Yeah, that's a very logical.
I mean,
conclusion.
keep it 100. You got to keep it a buck. And it was. I mean, and it's not to say I mean, I don't blame the FBI, ATF, DA, whoever. I mean, you realize you start looking at the numbers, and the fact of the matter is, there's more of them than there are you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the fact of the matter. You start again. You just analyzing. You're doing the calculus, and you realize this is probably a bad idea. It's probably a bad idea. So, to that, it's a strategic move, because you know if you were responsible for maintaining the order of a place, and I mean, that's why you have folks like Clive and Bundy and all these people. That's why you can just be like, I'm grazing my cattle over here.
I do what I want.
I'm gonna do what I want. You're not gonna stop me. And people show up to back them, and the government doesn't do anything because they know. Again, you're looking at the numbers. We don't have the numbers to actually, if these guys decide to raise up, and we don't have the numbers to actually counter it. So, and again, you can do this. You can look at this dispassionately. And and this is what I do a lot. I sit here and I think about a lot of this stuff, because you're just trying to figure out, okay, what are a reasonable set of possibilities for me to consider in terms of, like, what do I see as being a way forward?
Yeah.
In creating a future somewhere. Who can I identify as an ally? Who do I have to be careful of as a potential, enemy or liability or whatever? And then after you weigh all that stuff up, then you can figure out where you can go, right, and what you can do, and what are a reasonable set of expectations.
It's an exhausting calculus.
Yeah, I guess in the beginning, but it's interesting because at first when thinking about this stuff, you can obviously you can get worried, you can get anxious. Then there's sort of like heartbreak and disappointment and why, and then it comes a point where you move beyond that stuff. Because what ends up happening is, and I mean, I think part of this also is a product of kind of like my faith, like my belief, is that the world is not obliged to adhere to your preferences. Right? It doesn't have to entertain or fulfill your wishes as it accords to your preferences, because your preferences they're just a collection of things, at least at the moment, you happen to like. But ultimately, or the things that you want, but ultimately you don't actually know what you should want. Like, you actually don't know what's good for you. At the like, to really kind of look at maybe some of the metaphysics, you actually don't know, kind of independently of having, there's another set of information that would inform you about what it is that's good for you. You actually, in and of yourself, do not know what is good for you.
Yeah.
You just have a bunch of stuff that you prefer. I mean, it's like, the drug addict loves dope, right? And they think that the dope is good for them because it makes them feel good at the moment. But that same dope, if they keep on indulging in it, will eventually kill them, right? And
so,
they just
to use that metaphor, and kind of sum up what I'm hearing you say is, in a way, what's going on right now is, air quotes, white America, whatever that means, and
whatever that is,
and maybe specifically even well-meaning, in quotes, liberal, progressive, in quotes, individuals are they're dope. The thing that at the end of the day they may, like these addictions, there's a relapse. In this case, the relapse of convenience, the relapse of choosing to stay on top, those relapse moments, even though you may have good intentions, those cost Black Americans, the reinvention of the table in such a way that it is actually a table worth sitting at. And that's
and I mean, and I'd have to also extend that. I mean, whoever is having to bear the brunt of the maintenance of that order. So
it's not just that.
So we're talking about, like, if you're I mean, whoever's at the bottom rung of that that totem pole, or that ladder.
I mean, and I would argue, although race has been very firmly entrenched in the American psyche and maybe even the global psyche at this moment, due to the historical context that we've discussed and uncovered, there's some intentionality around that. I experience, you never know when your group is going to get, in quotes, your group. You never know when there's going to be a new group that gets sucked into the maw of getting othered, and, sort of like, it's not just like, and I think this explains, and I think the terror around that explains, it's used, that is a fact, and that fact is used in a confusing sort of way in order to keep, like why the hell are poor working class Americans predominantly, sort of like starting to veer towards, or seemingly, and I don't even know that this is true, to be honest, because like, if you talk to one person on another, I don't know what you'd actually find, but seemingly the portrayal in the media is like that group of people that was, that sort of fell out of the Rust Belt and all those other places seem to be veering towards some sort of ethno-nationalist kind of, fight to get there, to keep what they've got, that group of,
but again,
because they're worried they're going to become, they're feeling like they're going to become that group, which which is the other, that there'll be more brown people, and there's the liberals, and there's all these other people, and they'll create this new elite, and they'll be the downtrodden ones. And maybe that's even, I mean, I would honestly say that's not impossible. It's not crazy either. We have to also accept that the system can just arbitrarily pull a group of people, and that, in 20 years we can all be like, yeah, of course there's no such thing as race, but those people are pieces of shit. Whatever they are.
Yeah. However, that's the that has been the line that's been used.
Yeah.
As sort of this again, it's a false identity.
Yeah.
That has allowed for the things that you see in place to remain in place. So it's like, I can't remember who's quoted as saying this. I can't remember, it was like George Wallace or one of these folks in the South. Is like, and it was in reference to he was saying this about, it doesn't matter like how well educated or how elevated, specifically you're talking about Black folks, how elevated they are, what kind of degrees, whatever. It's like, you'll always be a nigger, right? That's in their minds, like the fact that these people, again, are this imaginary creation that they've made up in their mind. Like they're actually, like, they're holding on to that for dear life.
Boogeyman.
Like this, You know, it's like, and this is, and there's that great James Baldwin quote in this, and you should look up this interview that he does with Dr. Kenneth Clark from the early '60s, where he Kenneth Clark was asking the question. He's like, what, at the end of this interview, what would you say to America, and kind of in this moment? And this is 1963, all of these, the March on Washington, protests, all this stuff. And he says, he specifically was addressing the, again, quote unquote, so-called white America. Again, as Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, the people who believe themselves to be white. He says, what the white inhabitants of this country have to ask themselves was why it was necessary to create the nigger in the first place. And he said, because I'm not a nigger. He says, I'm a man. He says, but if you think I'm a nigger, he says, that means you need him. And the question you have to ask is why?
Yeah.
Like, why is it necessary for you to make me into something that I am not? But you're convinced that I am.
Mm.
And effectively, what that thing is a projection of something that comes from those people. Like, that's not my creation. Like, it's something you foisted on me, right? Or people that look like me, or whoever, like, is supposedly, is kind of fulfills the criteria of someone who would be classified as this thing. Like, that's not mine. That's yours. And he says, and I'm giving it back to you so you can figure that out.
Yeah.
So this goes back to what I was saying before about, I'm not obliged to participate in your delusion. Like, that's not my problem. That's your problem. I'm giving your problem back to you, and you figure that out, and I'm gonna go live my life.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And effectively what James Baldwin said to, when he was saying, all we want for you to do is just leave us alone. Right? That's what he said. He's like, we just need you to leave us alone. And apparently, you can't do that. Like, not you. I'm saying that the country cannot do that.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of the way that America operates that it needs selectively, like a very selective group of people to fail. It needs for them to fail.
Yeah.
And
that's kind of what I was asking about. Like, can that system, like, is it redeem? Like, can you reinvent that system in such a way that it doesn't necessitate failure? Like, because that is baked in. Like, that's the way it works.
It's it's entirely up to the people to reassess the belief, the assumption that the failure of certain groups of people is required in order for the place to function properly. Yeah. That's for the people who believe that to be the case to actually figure out.
Do you feel like that's a conversation that's do you feel like the progressive movement represents that conversation happening in a functional way right now, or not?
Maybe in part, and this is what I was saying before about, it's like people have sort of a commitment up to a point. Because here's the problem when you actually start sitting down and looking at this, like, honestly, like, you really stop being honest. And then and the thing that is really preventing people from being honest about this is certain people are going to find out that they're not the people who they thought they were.
Yeah, well, that's the key right there. Is like, who wants
and what happens is when certain folks realize that they are not the people that they thought they were, they'll fall apart.
That's right. I resonate with that. I think that's what you see. Yeah, it's what you see happen.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say it just links back to your point about, the opioid crisis and suicides. Like, what happens when the white man, middle-aged white guys start to realize that their, fantasies about who they think they are as far, like breadwinners and citizens and, like saving the world from itself or whatever the American sort of like exceptionalism, all these things is not true. Where do you start to identify? Where do you source your meaning from? How do you go through that transition? And how do we do that en masse? Like, how does a whole group of people initiate themselves into sourcing meaning from a new place? I mean, it's a big thing for humans. It's a big, scary thing.
Hey, you know what happened? Yeah, no, absolutely. What happens is it's false. That's what happens. You find out that religion is false. You find out that God doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
And then that's when you got to start finding things to take the edge off the pain that comes from realizing that all that stuff that you invested in, like, is bankrupt. That's where the drug addiction comes from. That's where people drinking comes from. That's where sex addiction comes from. That's where, adrenaline freaks, all that stuff. That's where you're trying to take the edge off.
And so in your own
personal
journey,
that's all that is.
In your own personal journey, did your conversion and embrace of Islam coincide with a sort of like shattering of like reality, some moment that you sort of like hit a moment where you realized that some construct that you were identifying with was sort of blatantly not true, and was
is that definitely?
Is there a linkage there? I don't know if
it was a matter of
yeah.
Say that again.
I was just saying, is there a linkage there for you? I think we just timed out a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think in large part. I mean, it also, it's coming to realize the reality of your mortality. So when I was 19, my father was killed in a car accident in New Jersey. He was driving home from work. He was about 2 minutes from where he lived. He was driving back. He was driving from Princeton back to where he was living at the time. And he fell asleep at the wheel, and he ran up the road and he hit a small concrete abutment. Couldn't have been, it was barely a foot tall, and it just caught the undercarriage of the car. And I had just seen him 2 days prior. I was just with him. We were in New Hampshire, funnily enough. It was my first time in New Hampshire. And what's crazy is on that trip, I ended up passing by the place that I eventually went to start working, my first job out of college. A year and a half, almost 2 years later, at Dean Kamen's place in Manchester, at DECA Research and Development. He was the person I was like closest to. He was kind of like my go-to guy, like the dude that was like the guy I hung out with. Like, that was my ace. And I remember always thinking about whether, like, I would always think, like, then what would I do if something were to happen to him? And thinking that it would be like, I don't know if I can handle it. And then it happened, and I didn't end up reacting in the way that I thought I would. And I remember the week I had to, like, I remember, this is right around the time that the Gulf War was actually going on. This is like January 92. So Gulf War I, January 92. So I remember, I was home on break from college, and I had to go and drive down to New Jersey to identify the body. So I remember they went to the morgue, and I remember they went to the hospital, and they had him like a morgue, and they had to pull him out in the on the slab, and I remember just like looking at him. I just remember looking in his face and just, oh my God, like he's really gone.
Hmm.
And that was like one of the seminal moments that eventually led to me becoming Muslim. What is it, 7 years later? And it was just the idea that you realize how tenuous the line is between life and death, and so you just begin to cut through a lot of the BS, and you're just like, I just want to find out what I'm supposed to do. Like I remember this was a constant thought with me. I just need to find out what I'm supposed to do, right? So I could just get to doing it. I've only got but so much time, and I just want to figure it out so I can do it. And that, I think that laid the groundwork for me to kind of be open to the ideas, the things that were communicated within Islam. And then once I'd met a group of people, after living in California for a couple of years, and I just really liked them. I mean, they didn't proselytize. There was something about them and the way they were that I was just really drawn to. And then I got curious, like after I realized, oh, wait a minute, all these guys are Muslim, and I just started doing my own research. And then I was like, ding, this is what I've been looking for. Like, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And it was just like that. It was just like I found where I'm supposed to be. But it was certainly just what you were saying. It's like there is an aspect of that you have like a certain amount of comfort where you may find yourself at a given moment in terms of, your world is sort of constructed in a particular way, and then something happens to shake that, and then you begin to question things, and you begin to reassess things, and and you're challenged, and sometimes we need that, because you might have some very false notions about yourself, and the world that you live in, and where you are positioned, or where you are oriented in the midst of that order. And then sometimes you need to be shaken up so that you can actually be more in line with the way that things actually are, as opposed to the way that you would like to believe they are. And I think over the course of your life, the gap between the two is closed more and more, till eventually you are actually in line, you're actually aligned with the way that reality functions, as opposed to the way you would like to believe that it functions. Those are two entirely different things.
Is that intersection inevitable just in death, or is this something to strive for, as far as, sort of a personal, I don't know, a personal growth quest, or a little bit of both in that?
I think ultimately, I think at the heart of all this is you have to want to know what is true. And you have to want to know what is true more than you want what you believe would make you happy.
More than your vision of comfort, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I think there's I was just reading this there was a little blurb about Nietzsche. He was talking about, people wanting more than just being happy. Ultimately, people aren't only searching for they're not only searching for happiness. He said ultimately people are searching for meaning.
Meaning, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And you suffer. I
and
mean, if you are dedicated to meaning, it brings meaning to suffering, because you can't just be happy because shit happens.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like I've always found that very curious about people who, there are people who either, well, not necessarily agnostic, but at least people who say, I don't believe in God. Or why don't you believe in God? Well, because, why do bad things happen to good people? The whole kind of the theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there suffering in the world? Why is this? And which is really, really kind of funny to me. I mean, or why do bad things happen? Yeah, why do bad things happen to good people, or people who they believe don't deserve to have bad things happen to them?
Deserve.
Right. Okay. Well, it's like, well, I guess first of all, you have to define what is bad and what is good. Like, how do you define bad and good? Like, do you mean that so is something, again, that you don't prefer, or that you wouldn't, necessarily choose for yourself initially, you're characterizing that as bad? And it's like, well, how do you know? All you know is you have a preference, but you don't actually know whether or not the thing you prefer is actually good for you, or if it's bad for you, or if it's bad for you, right? You just know, you just have a preference. All of the prophetic stories, a lot of the stories of, sort of the saints and the Sufis and the, holy, all of those stories are about the worst things happening to the best people. Mm-hmm. Like, none of those people quote unquote deserve what happened to them. The whole point was to see how good people deal with difficult situations,
adversity. Yeah.
And that's when you really find out, who people really are. And I'll give you a story. I mean, it's not a prophetic story, but it's a story, actually a story about a guy I've been working with for for several years. And I mean, every time I talk to this dude, it's like, oh my God, dude, like, like, how are you still going? So this guy I met several years ago, who actually invited me to work on this project in Afghanistan. You should check it out. It's called Plant for Peace. And the guy who his name's James Brett. James, his story is unfreaking believable. So James grew up in a community where his grandfather was a kind of like the head of this like small religious community, and this is in Swindon, which I believe is that Sussex? I'm not sure what county that is. But it's kind of going more towards London, and not that far from Reading. And his family was at the center of this community. And his mom, took care of.
Hey, Rhamis, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. I'm just noting we're rapidly approaching the top of the hour, and I'm actually gonna.
Okay, sorry.
I'm gonna have another person pop into this.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry.
Room.
Yeah, my bad.
Anyway, I should have said something a couple minutes. I was engrossed by the story, and then I looked at the time. And I was like, oh.
No, I feel you. So yeah, I mean, that's actually a whole nother podcast all on its own. But you should, if you can, you should look up Plant for Peace. I've been involved with that project since 2011.
I brought it up. I'm looking forward to checking it out.
It's pretty crazy when you actually start looking at all of the pieces, and it's even crazier once you find out more of the backstory on it. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Anyway.
Well, man, I'm excited.
But, I hope this. I don't know if you got anything out of this.
Hey, man, it was great to chat, and I think there's some real important stuff emerging here. I mean, at least for me, it's a thought that I've had before, but reconsidering, how closely addiction and the process and how correlated that is with what, all this stuff on many different levels. And, anyway, so I'm taking that away. Maybe listeners will too. I just really appreciate you taking some time to, and kind of frame out the historical perspective. And so I'm just super grateful for your time, man.
I appreciate you getting in touch. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we need to connect on as far as like kind of work stuff, and I think there are a number of things that it would be good to discuss as far as that goes.
Let's do it. Let's do it again soon, and even just chat and just one-on-one. Thank you so much, Rhamis.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gregory. And I brag on you and Ethan all the time with like, you got to talk to my guys that did regenerative enterprise, and like I brag on you guys all the time.
Yeah, likewise. All right. Peace, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Be good. Take care.